Hello, I'm Stuart Bowes, and you're watching or listening to the Net Hero podcast. This is a podcast for you if you care about what we're doing to the planet. You don't have to be an eco-warrior. We believe business is the solution to making things better. But we're for people who want to make that difference by either cutting their emissions or coming up with ideas that can help us do things a bit better. We've featured politicians, academics, lots and lots of business people, entrepreneurs, inventors, and of course people who are just interested in doing the right thing. So sit back, listen and enjoy, and make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Please share it with your friends and colleagues, and you can always check out our two websites that cover all of this, Energy Live News and futurenetzero.com. This podcast is purely editorial, so sit back and enjoy this week's episode. You can't have missed the report that came out from the Tony Blair Institute. It came out recently and it was all about where we're going about net zero. I've been wanting to get the author on, and I'm delighted to say that Lindy Fursman is joining us today. But before I bring Lindy in, this I think was a really interesting piece, and there was a lot of controversy about it because it seemed to say what a lot of people in the industry think, which is net zero at this juncture is possibly, not just possibly, it's probably really realistically leaving consumers a little bit cold. People have got bored of it. People are worried about the bills. People are worried about the costs. And are the decisions being made the right ones, depending on how you sit where you are in the world? The report came out a little while ago, and it looked at kind of where things are and made a very sort of bold statement that basically it seems that climate change at present is divisive, and that a lot of the things that people are doing are perhaps putting the public right off it, and, in the words of Tony Blair's forward, are doomed to fail. So, what did the report really say? How did it come about? Let's discuss that. And I'm delighted to say, as I said, Lindy, who was the author, joins me now. Hello, Lindy.
Hi there. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for this. I know you're a very busy person, so it's really good to get you. First of all, for people who don't know what the Tony Blair Institute is, what is it? Can you explain?
So the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change advises political leaders across the world. So we're currently working in more than 40 countries, advising leaders at the top echelons of government, right through their strategy, policy, through to implementation of their priorities. And there's a thread sort of technology as an enabler for all three of those. So that's what the Institute does.
So it's not really writing for us as you know, the public or people in business. It's writing to the decision makers. Is that fair?
Yeah, political leaders are our target audience for our work, whether that's in the sort of global pieces that I produce with my team in the climate and energy space, or whether that's in-country work with governments, which is what a lot of our staff do. So we do work not only on climate and energy, but also on health policy, on science and innovation, on economics, on a whole range of issues, of which climate and energy is just one.
What's your background? Are you a climate scientist?
No, I'm not a climate scientist, but I'm a policymaker by training. So I used to be a chief advisor for climate change in New Zealand. You can probably tell from my accent.
Yes.
So I was the chief advisor for climate in the New Zealand Ministry for the Environment. I spent a couple of years in Parliament with our then climate change minister, advising him directly, and prior to that worked in climate policy and economic policy actually for the New Zealand Treasury. My background is in climate policy as opposed to climate science.
So how did this report come about? I mean, did Tony just say one day, hey, you know what, Lindy, I'd like to get a report on climate change and our policies? Or was this something that came about as a kind of, internal discussion, looking at the way things have bedded in, probably over the last few years after COVID as well?
I think the report's probably been a good year in the making in terms of its background. one of the things that we've recognised over the past year or so is really how much the climate debate has become quite polarised,
Oh yeah.
where you see, sort of both ends of the spectrum of that debate sort of getting further apart, and really a sort of loss of the pragmatic centre about what do we do next, given the state of global emissions and where climate action is at. I think sort of probably a year or more in its origin. And I think that, the real intent of the paper is to open up the debate and say, actually, looking forward, do we need some additional strategies and some additional actions here?
Was it something that came about, as I said, from the team, or is this something that's commissioned directly by Tony?
It's a paper commissioned by Tony directly.
Right.
He is, talking to leaders across the world,
Ah.
on climate and energy issues, amongst other things. So it's a recognition of where things are globally. It's a globally focused paper. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Again, before we go into the depths of it, how much is this based on observation? How much of this is scientific data? Did you work with scientists? Did you pull together teams from across the world? How did you pull this paper together?
Yeah, so we've got a team of policy experts here at the TBI. So we've been doing work in climate and energy for some years, certainly prior to me joining, 14 months ago. And we do have teams across the world as well who are, talking about and reporting back sort of policy developments and, across a whole range of different climate issues, whether that's carbon markets or whether that's climate targets or domestic decarbonisation policies. And then we do have a network of various experts that we also draw on as well.
Right. Did you work with the UN, the IPCC, or any of that for this, or is this kind of pulled together data and you're using scientific experts that are kind of within the field in different areas?
Yeah, we didn't work with any of those bodies on this paper. I mean, I have been involved in the IPCC process for New Zealand in the past, so some engagement on there, including the sixth assessment report summary for policymakers, where I was on the negotiating team. So yeah, and certainly drew on a lot of evidence, for example, from the IEA and from UNEP, and
Gotcha.
those very trusted sources for data and trend analysis.
It's a decent paper, really chunky and everything, but in essence, and it's called the climate paradox. It has kind of, from my view, and you're the expert, you wrote it. It's kind of sort of a couple of things that really pull me up. One is kind of the core argument. Is the present strategy the right one? And if we are to do it, are we bringing the whole world with us? Then a bit about technology, and then there's the sort of politics and the public. So I'd like to break it down, if I've got that right, into those sort of areas. So the first one is you sort of suggest that kind of current strategies, phasing out rapidly fossil fuels and trying to, stop changing consumers' budgets. That's not going to work. Why do you feel that?
Well, certainly, I think it's important to acknowledge there is lots of good action happening
Yeah.
globally. We do see, very rapid rollout in some places, of solar and wind and, clean energy technologies. But there's no escaping the fact that every year emissions continue to rise. So that suggests if we continue on, and even if we're able to accelerate our current strategies, we still have a problem. The global carbon budget is, in terms of what we've got left before we, breach those tipping points, is very, very close. So we need some new strategies to go alongside the action that we're seeing, and that's what the paper tries to do, is say, global emissions are rising every year, yet we see the hottest temperatures on record in the past year, and certainly already noises about that for this year as well. And that's what I identify as the climate paradox. Everyone can see those rising temperatures, they can see rising emissions. So actually, what do we do? How can we change what we're doing to actually accelerate the change that we need to see a bit faster?
Do you think there's been a schism since COVID? It seems like COVID was a thing, for us. I mean, we create a future net zero in 2020 because, you know, the Conservative government in the UK committed in 2019 to the net zero target of 2050. And then you had that real period where everyone was going, yeah, we're going to commit, we're going to commit. I think COVID changed a lot of people. Suddenly, you know, cities stopped and you can hear the birds, you can see animals. And there seemed to be a sort of, global consensus that we've got to go and do this. Since then, from what we can see, there's been a shift. There's been a shift in terms of politicians. There's been a shift in terms of business. Can you put your hand down and say what's happened in these kind of 4 or 5 years, or have I got that wrong? Is that the same sort of impression you have?
No, that is aligned. That is aligned with what we're seeing. And, you know, if you look globally, you can see, you know, some governments walking back from their targets. You can see businesses, you know, walking back from some of their goals. And you can see voters electing leaders who are not prioritising the climate necessarily. And I think that in part that is because of some of the other pressures we're seeing in the system, you know, certainly economic stagnation post-COVID, you know, cost of living crisis across the world. And I think that that's really impacted sort of general willingness to bear costs for the climate where it's not clear that those are going to deliver impact. So, you know, we did some polling, last year just across Europe, and we found that, you know, people really care about climate action. People want climate action. But they don't believe that the policies we're implementing globally are actually delivering impact. And when you look at global emissions, it's quite hard to argue against that. So people are willing, you know, potentially to bear some costs, but only if they think that the policies that are driving those costs are actually going to bring down emissions.
Your report is global, right? So
it is indeed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't like it. It's a sort of bullshit term, but, you know, you can say kind of the global north and global south, whatever. But, you know, there are richer developed nations, there are developing nations, and there are poorer nations, right? And that's pretty much covering the world. It seems like, and again, I might be wrong on this, but I get the feeling that the developed nations jumped on this, said they were going to do it. Developing nations were like, hang on a second, you've had all of this for the last 200 years. We've got to get our people out of this, and we need energy that's cheaper and plentiful. And the people who are the poorest seem to be getting it from both sides, right? They're more vulnerable to climate change. And I remember going to COP in Glasgow, and they're saying, well, no one's really helping us. They talk a lot of crap, but they're not giving us the money. So in that way, is this a shift globally in all those three sort of major areas of the world where it seems to be the people who would be most at risk, they seem to be left out of the conversation. Everything you hear about the COPs seems to be those people are not being part of it. And it's become a conversation about money and how much it costs us.
Yeah, I think it's been a conversation about money for a long time, actually. Right. And I think that, you know, one of the principles of the Paris Agreement, you know, 10 years ago was common but differentiated responsibilities. So recognizing that difference between developed countries having seen the benefits of growth for their economies based on a fossil fuel economy, and then countries who are still developing or yet to develop being asked to decarbonise. And so I think it's been that conversation for some time. I think that the last few years have really exacerbated or brought that to a head because, you know, you can, you know, as fiscal pressures become tight and, you know, geopolitics as they are, you know, just adds an additional layer of complexity on the question of who funds climate action and, you know, particularly where that sits outside of the developed world.
Is there a schism in terms of kind of politicians? You know, like you said, there seemed to be a unity maybe 5 years ago globally. And now I can see definite fractions around the world politically and from business. Is there now a schism?
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing the polarization of the debate. So, you know, the extent to which I would say some political factions are exploiting the growing. I wouldn't say it's a schism. I feel like I think it's a gap that is widening though because of that polarization. So, and that has enabled the exploitation of some of these issues to portray climate action as something that's, a nice to have or part of the woke agenda, or instead of something that really should be thought about as a key part of economic growth and economic resilience in the medium term.
Is that just down to cost? Because I can't remember which article I read, but not that long ago said, we jumped into all of this by going, let's have a target. Let's have the year, and it's good to have targets and businesses like that. But no one really thought about what are the technologies going to get us there? What are we going to do it? And it's as if we've made a plan. It's like I think the analogy sometimes, someone said they bought the house, then they didn't realize that there were termites, and then they had to rebuild the roof and all of that, and it looked great. And it's as if the costs of all of this, because we're changing a system that we've had for nearly 250 years globally. It's massive, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, when you think about it, the process of decarbonisation is actually an economic transformation project.
Yeah.
So how do you actually transform your sources of growth and your ability to develop and raise the standard of living globally, while at the same time, taking fossil fuels out of the system? There are so many technologies where the economic benefits of deployment are greater than the costs.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that there aren't some upfront costs that policymakers need to grapple with and think creatively about how they're going to finance. So, when we think about the sources of future emissions and we think about countries whose, large populations perhaps are moving more into the middle class and what that means for energy demand, there's a big question there about actually how do those countries get the capital they need to ensure that they meet that demand with clean energy? And how do you do that in a time where, globally there are fiscal constraints and geopolitical tensions? And how do you think about that in a nuanced way to enable us to get where we need to be?
The public, you're from New Zealand, you've got a big environmental movement there. You've been here, I think you said 14 months. So you probably have seen the Just Stop Oil and all of that stuff that has been running for the last 3-4 years here and various campaigns. It seems to be that the public have split as well, where people there's so many doomsayers about climate change that they've kind of, frankly, pissed everyone off. And all the direct action, although in some ways has been good because it's raised the profile, has drawn the public into a kind of, this is just stopping our lives, right? And so there's been a backlash. And I don't know if that's happened around the world, but I've seen bits of it in other countries as well. This kind of, you've got to go green, and there's only one way, which is full electrification. Or, hang on a second, what about the cost? Are we now really kind of a polarized society? Because like you said right at the beginning, you said most people would agree that there should be something done on climate change. But there are some people who are just so at the extreme that they'll never hear any other thing. They only want one form of energy. That's really become quite strong now, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's why in the report I, try and say we need to make the green choice the best choice. So, if you're choosing a new car, you choose the one that's the best, and we need to make sure that that is an EV, and that is increasingly the case, in terms of the choices people are making. So, what I'd like to see is, our ability to harness sort of new technology to actually, to make that the obvious choice, regardless of what you think about the climate, or regardless of where you sit on that spectrum of climate act versus climate denier. So it's obviously an extreme spectrum, but we really want to make sure that is the easiest, best choice, the best product so that it sort of takes that moral positioning out of it.
Is the problem that the public are being asked to make sacrifices that cost them? EVs are more expensive right now. Our energy bills are going up. I can speak for the UK, but around the world you can see it. Then you're told you're going to have to change your lifestyle, don't eat meat or whatever. It seems to be this narrative has grown that, to get this, you've got to make a lot of sacrifice. And then people go, hang on a second, I just want to put food on the table, look after my kids. I don't want to feel guilty that I'll get taken a flight to Spain. And you're making me feel like that. This narrative has really grown strong that, to do it, there's a kind of, well, you shouldn't do anything. You must sacrifice. You talk about this in your paper. What do you think about that line of that the disconnect between sort of policies and public will?
Yeah, and I think this is where it comes back to impact, right? So, policymakers can ask people to make those choices, but if they don't see that those choices are actually driving impact, if they see every year emissions continuing to rise,
There we go.
then I think that's really the heart of the problem. So I do feel like some of the policies that we're looking at globally are asking people to make decisions or face costs. You mentioned EVs. EVs are actually a cheaper vehicle over their lifetime. There's no doubt. There's no doubt about that. But you're right that the upfront cost of that is a barrier for many people. Okay, so let's think, about how you can capitalize those future savings in a way that helps people to get into those vehicles, better vehicles, earlier. So, and I think we need to change the narrative around this. So we need to be able to say, this is the best choice because it's the best vehicle. There's a way to get around the upfront cost so that people don't feel like they're being asked to make sacrifices. And these are the things that are going to drive the most impact globally. So let's focus on those.
People talk about what does make the biggest impact, and I won't name the person, but there was someone quite senior I spoke to who said, really, the truth is, it's all about, big nations cutting their emissions. So it's more about decarbonising your grid, decarbonising your transport, heat. These are the big policy levers. You and I getting in EVs or not flying to Benidorm, wherever we want to go, that isn't really a big thing, right? And flights overall aren't going to be a really big thing. It's about massive political decisions by nations that will shift the lever the most, rather than this narrative of we've all got to do our little bit. Do you agree with that?
I don't agree that it is quite as clear cut as that.
Right.
So 100% agree that it is, large nations, national decarbonisation that will have the most impact. If you look at where the sources of emissions are, so those are the places we should be targeting. But I also don't think it's a get out of jail free for individuals. I'm from New Zealand, 0.17% of global emissions. Does that mean New Zealand, shouldn't take climate action? No, we actually need everybody, every country, individuals doing their part. It's a collective problem. It's a global problem, and we need global action. But that's not to say, as I said, we need to also be able to show impact. So, if the choices that those nations are making in terms of their domestic policies are not driving impact and bringing emissions down, then there is quite a big question about the extent to which, we're losing the social license for climate action, for that more significant climate action.
That's a very tricky one for a politician, because how will I know? How can I show? If someone says to me, "Do you know what the policy we've done?" I suppose the only one that would really make you think is if cars became electric, you don't get the fumes, right? There's an obvious one, right? That we can see, we can smell it, we can taste it. Or if chimneys in Poland stop chucking out black gas, people can see it. But if you say to me, "Oh, the temperature rise has been reduced by 0.25 rather than it would have been," I won't know. Do you see what I'm trying to say? The way you can actually show these policies working is quite difficult for governments to manifest, isn't it?
Well, yeah, although, many policy makers and, within governments do have the ability to estimate the emissions impacts of the policies that are being put in place.
But are they not communicating it well enough then in your mind?
I think it's a really difficult thing to communicate. We can talk about marginal abatement cost curves, and we can talk about, all of that stuff. It is difficult. It's a difficult, complex area to communicate. I think there is a way of being able to demonstrate the most impactful interventions, and to be careful about communications around those.
I want to talk about a couple of things before we end. COP. I mean, I went to COP, and I've only been to one, and I thought it was fine, all right, but I really didn't think I saw anything achieved. I saw a complete sort of, big brands there saying we're all being nice and clean and looking after bunnies in the Amazon or whatever it was. I felt a lot of greenwashing. Sorry, I'm quite direct. This is the sort of stuff that I saw. And then you've seen the last few COPs, a lot of criticism, held in, countries that are fossil fuel nations. And some will say, well, that's the right thing to do. Maybe that's the wrong thing to do. You talk about COP and you say that the framework is probably not the right one. What's your take on whether the COPs have kind of run out of time?
I'm a big fan, actually, of the multilateral process, and I think that that process of the COPs has delivered. With the Paris Agreement, we got a shared temperature goal.
Okay.
We got a system of ratcheting ambition up through NDCs. We got rules about how countries report their emissions. We got rules around carbon markets and trading. We got a finance goal. So I would say over the past 10 years, that process has delivered. However, what I would also add to that is we have rising global emissions. I keep coming back to this point, right?
Yeah.
And so the question is, can that process deliver accelerated action fast enough? And if not, what do you need to put beside it? Smaller plurilateral solutions, perhaps, which is what I suggest in the paper, that can actually accelerate emissions coming down by ensuring that those countries who are going to be who either are the largest emitters or will be the emitters of the future are actually at the head of the table and co-designing those solutions. Again, I'm from New Zealand. That multilateral process is critical for smaller countries who might not necessarily be at other tables, not in the G7 or not in the G20.
Yeah, of course.
And so if you're from a very small economy, that is the table, where you get a voice in the climate debate. So that's important. But there is also the question of impact and emissions and what you need to do to bring those down. In the paper, I say, we need to think about how you actually get impact faster.
Would you continue with COPs?
I think, yes.
Or they have to change and become more regional?
I think the question is what else you need beside that, so maybe the COP as it currently sits continues as I say, a forum where you do need every country in the world at the table, all 196 parties at the table. But in terms of actually the speed of action that we now need, I think we need something else to go beside that. And for me, that's the solutions that focus on the major sources of emissions, both now and in the future.
Technology, before we go, it's a big thing, right? And some say, what's the quote from The Martian? I'm going to science the shit out of this. And that's what people say, We get AI, we get nuclear fusion, we have far new technologies that will come, even things that we don't know are coming down the line. And I really wanted to know whether you think that technology is one of those things that will drive this, that there are things that perhaps not even around the corner, maybe just around a couple of months away, could become real big change makers for what we do. And others are saying, actually, no, don't try these technologies. It's a waste. Go back to kind of, reducing demand, and don't go and build these big wind farms. Don't build the underwater cabling. Don't go for fusion. Where do you sit on the technology sort of as the not the savior, but the way to get us to get rid of emissions?
Well, I guess a few things on that. Firstly, technology is a very broad concept. Yeah. So in the paper, I talk about AI era technologies as being key to helping us with some of our existing technologies. So for example, the use of AI to help with the deployment of solar. That's a really great example, I think, in terms of, ensuring that, panels are sited and, the optimal angle and speeding up the process. So using new technologies to speed up the deployment of existing solutions we already have. And then I talk about other newer technologies. So, for example, as you say, a note to fusion, a note to new nuclear, a note, I would say, to direct air capture as well as one of those, which are technologies I think that, we need to be thinking hard about, given what we know about future energy demand. And, when it comes to direct air capture, technologies we may need in the future if we want to remain within our temperature goals. So, yes, these are technologies some of these that are not commercially viable or not, yet proven. And, we could walk away from that and say, okay, well, too hard, let's just continue what we're doing. But, if we'd done that with some of our, if we'd done that 10 or 15 years ago with some of the technologies that are commonplace now, we would be in a far worse position. So again, it's not an either or. It's not a don't continue with what we've got and put all our hopes on technology of the future. It's let's think carefully about how we use what we've got, how we use what is in the very near term, and then how we put out, where we put our bets for those technologies that are a bit further away.
You said just a little bit earlier that you've got to look at where things are going, right? Rather than where things are. Southeast Asia, Africa, China, whatever. These areas are changing. Africa's changing enormously. Africa has so many different nations moving at different paces. And yet these countries often are not at that first policy making table deciding these things. That has to change, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. If you look at population growth projections
Yeah,
and you think about energy demand as populations not only grow but also develop, and you put those two things together, so for example, India has a per capita energy use of, 1/3 of the global average, 1/5 of China, and 1/10 of the United States. And you think about, even that country's per capita use moving towards the median and what that means for emissions
absolutely.
if there is not
Mm.
clean energy deployment to meet those, and the capital flowing to enable that, then there is a really significant question about, what our temperature goals look like. So I think you're right. I think we need to look at, those regions of the world and be ensuring that they have the capital and the technology to enjoy the benefits of development that, much of the developed world is resting on.
Before we go, what's been the reaction to this from around the world? I know we've seen things here from Labour, and we've seen things from other sort of politicians, but globally, has this been well received, or have you had people saying, "What have you written here?"
Well, ironically, I would say that it's a snapshot of where we started, which is the polarization
Yeah.
of the debate. So,
So yeah, the
yeah,
polarized responses.
yeah. So, a lot of very positive feedback.
Yeah.
At last, someone is saying this. Great to see. Also, some definite pushback on, this doesn't capture enough of what we're good progress that we're making. So, yeah, I think it's a nice snapshot actually of what I see in the broader debate. And the point of the paper, as I said, was to actually start some of this debate.
Yeah.
So I think it's been successful.
It's done that job very well. Yeah.
In that way. I think now that more nuanced commentary, from people who have actually read the paper, which has always got not just the media on the paper, is coming through. That's really great to see.
In the end, it really is about our politicians, isn't it? Going back to the beginning, because if they don't make that right choice, because they'll set the rules for business people, they'll set the rules for us as consumers, they'll set, simple rule of putting on a seatbelt became law. Suddenly, a lot more people's lives were saved. Do you think politically it's so difficult now? We're more fractured and more divided than we ever were. But do you think we'll ever get to a stage, or will it be lots of different countries, in your view, moving differently? And in the end, whether 2050 happens or not, at least they're all on the same trajectory. What's your hope?
I actually don't think we have a choice. When you say whether we get to 2050 or not, I take it you mean whether we get to net zero at 2050, as opposed to.
Well, yeah, I hope we get to 2050.
Indeed. I think the reality is that, with the range of climate events that we're seeing and the frequency and severity of those, I think, and the links between those events and economic resilience across the world, I think we're, very quickly in a place where this is not something, that this will move beyond politics, and we do need to see, the acceleration of action. So I think at the moment we are in a very polarized place, and we do see a fracturing of bipartisanship around this issue. But my hope is that, the pragmatism and the practical solutions and the need for faster action returns sooner rather than later.
Brilliant. Good place to end. Listen, thank you so much, Lindy, for joining us. Really good to get the views from someone who actually wrote the thing and went through it all. So I bet you're glad it's out now.
Yeah, I look forward to the ongoing debate and discussion.
I think it's a really great thing.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Lindy. Thank you, audience, for watching and listening. Tell us what you think. Hopefully some of you have read the report. Go and have a look at it and tell us your views. Thank you to Zoe for production on this week's episode of the Net Hero Podcast. See you soon.
You've just heard the Net Hero Podcast from FutureNetZero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. FutureNetZero.com. Better business, better planet.